certainly see a lot of debates in Europe. Here in the UK regarding the EU referendum, you have a lot of things about this growing populism where the debates are about definitely something else. And with all this good media we have, with all this, think tanks working, how come that, it's really, and to which extent is really, let's say, a threat to Europe?
So I think the question is, why are people no longer making fact-based arguments? Why are so many arguments being conducted in public based on conspiracy theories or imaginary stories? Why doesn't the old system whereby people could sort out truth from falsehood, why aren't these things working anymore? And I think there are a number of reasons. One of them is to do with the collapse or the perceived collapse of the mainstream media and the feeling that traditional newspapers aren't as strong as they were, they aren't as reliable as they were. Many of them have become more tabloidy in their tone, and that reduces their credibility. I think social media has played a really important role in changing how people analyze politics. People get their news from their friends, or they live in these kind of silos whereby they hear the same stories repeated over and over again by people who feed them through their Twitter feed or their Facebook page, and they don't have any alternate source of news, and people are losing their sense that there's some source that you can turn to that's true, or there's something that's reliable. And so that means that you now have these whole political movements based on sort of illogical propositions, or people who are who make claims that can't be proved. And it's becoming more and more difficult to have a kind of rational debate about policy when there are so few places where policy can really be discussed.
But is it something unique which is taking place in our times, or was it something which is also present, we just didn't mention?
I mean, it's clearly worse than it used to be. It used to be possible in the national media to have a debate about education policy or about judicial reform. In some parts of the British media, or in some countries that still have proper media, you can have those conversations. But in a lot of countries, there really isn't a place to have a policy debate anymore. It can only take place on the margins or in the fringes. In Poland, or in the Czech Republic, or in many countries that have very small medias, you simply don't have a public discussion of policy. What is our budgeting process? How much money can we give to certain items? How much taxes do we take in? There isn't really a very sophisticated debate about those issues. And so what you have instead is media that focuses on scandals or fake scandals or rivalries. And what it does is it loses its credibility. And people just don't believe anything they read anymore, because it's all kind of scandal and tit for tat, and none of it seems very important.
At the same time, we do have some quality media, and in that way there are a lot of institutions which are working to do something. So are there any idea, with what we start, how to get out of that kind of debate and where to have
it's something I'm trying to work on myself, to understand what it is that could bring quality back to media, or could convince people once again to examine what are the sources of what they read. Yes, as you say, yes, there is quality media, and I actually, I don't want to exaggerate the problem too much. I live now most of the time in the UK, which has really good quality media. Some, it has the BBC, it has the Financial Times, it has a few institutions that people do trust, at least most of the time, to have a fact-checking process. They trust that journalists are trying to find out real stories. But not everybody gets their news from those media, and the tabloids and are much less responsible even than they used to be. And of course, the pressure from social media now is to really just make things up.
And how big is the impact to the governments and to the real policies which are introduced? Because it's okay, we have a poor political discussion, but if you still have the system in place,
I think there's a question now whether you can still have democratic government if you don't have any kind of public debate. Because if there isn't a public debate, and you aren't talking about the real budget or the real decision about education reform, or you aren't talking about real subjects, then what are you talking about? Then you're talking about kind of gossip and intrigue. And then there's no pressure on the government to behave well or be good. And the media, when it functions as a source of pressure, not just anti-corruption pressure, which is of course also important, but also as a source of pressure. The public cares about education. The public cares about, traffic laws. The public cares about, the rule of law being applied fairly. The public cares how the police behave. And the media can reflect these public concerns, even not only during elections, but in between elections. And the media can force themes to the surface and can make officials react. But if the media is just writing about nonsense and fake scandals, then that's what the government reacts to, not public concern for cleaner air.
And so, for instance, what are these debates currently now? As you see, we now have a very interesting debate about the Brexit, about the UK exit from the European Union, and I won't ask how probable is that, but what is currently the discussion about it?
Brexit, actually, of these kinds of debates taking place now, is not one of the worst, because there's a long-standing debate about the EU and Britain. Some people, and certainly in public life, know the issues pretty well, and people are. A lot of the argument is taking place at a high level. I mean, the trouble is that, there are a lot of facts thrown around in the course of the debate. There are a lot of people claiming the EU does things that it doesn't do. There's a lot of speculation. So the question is how to keep the facts, how to keep the debate fact focused, if that's the right word.
And can we, at least in Ukraine, it's very hard to understand. How close is Britain to getting out of EU? How big is support?
I think it's very possible that Britain will leave the EU. I think I can see the scenario. I can see how it happened. There are some very serious people on the Brexit, on the pro-leaving side. It's probably the trouble is that absolutely nobody honest, if you speak honestly about it, nobody knows what will happen when Britain leaves. Nobody knows how many companies will leave the country. Nobody knows what it means for Britain to leave EU institutions. Will it leave the security institutions, for example, the system of sharing information about terrorism which exists within the EU? Well, Britain leaves that. What does that mean? Britain leaves the single market. Nobody knows what that means. Or Britain tries to stay in the single market, but will have to rewrite its treaties. There will be a long period of real uncertainty, and it won't be clear at all for a long time what the impact will be. And the idea that it will be some easy process and then we'll get out and everything will be better is just absurd. It's a little bit like the Brexit debate is a little bit like the Scotland debate that took here a year ago, in which the people arguing for leaving, just like the people arguing for leaving the EU, are very idealistic. We'll leave, we'll have a better country, Scotland, independent Scotland will be a better place. But there was a kind of there was a kind of almost naive imagination. You hear that a little bit here. We'll leave the EU and then we'll become less corrupt and life will be better and everything will be fixed. It's a kind of magic solution. I guess it's magic thinking that people want now. Look, we'll do this one big thing and then everything will be over. And that's now what you have, pervasive in public life.
And when it possibly could take place?
Oh, the Brexit vote is in June 23rd, and we'll know after that. Lots of people think Britain will stay in, but I can certainly see a vote to leave. And of course the vote to leave won't really be about Europe and the institutions of Europe and what Britain is doing in Europe. The vote will be about, I don't like immigrants, or I think there's too much regulation and I'm blaming the EU for it, or I dislike globalization and I don't want our country to be part of it. I want to build walls around my country and keep it a certain way. A lot of the emotions around the debate will have nothing to do with the realities of European institutions or what it means that Britain is part of them.
And what we see that it's not just a European issue. We really following the Trump debate in the United States, which and I'm following that, and how you also would explain this kind of a strong popularity, because some time ago it wouldn't look probable that Trump would participate because it's not it couldn't be tolerated.
In essence, I think the vote for Trump is a vote for against globalization. It's we don't want the outside world. we don't want we don't want the kinds of engagement we've had. We don't like the fact that the banks did so well after 2008 and most ordinary people didn't. It's kind of vote against the establishment. It's a vote against both major parties, I think, which made a mistake this year, both putting up as their main candidate people from the Clinton and Bush families, which people in America felt that to be deeply unfair. Why is this oligarchy, this nepotism, ruling us? And I still think it was a huge mistake. It's also a certain amount of ignorance. I mean, what Trump really is, what he's done. People don't seem to really care about that or know about that. That he's swindled people through he created this sort of essentially fake university. That he's lost so much money. That he's run all these business scams. I mean, that doesn't seem to bother people right now. People just want to say, I hate the establishment and I'm irresponsible and so I want out.
And how we can place, in this, with Trump, running for president in the US, with all these events taking place in Europe, in Brexit, in Poland, elsewhere, why do we put Russia in this global context?
I mean, Russia supports some of these populist movements. We know it supports the far right in a lot of countries. We know Russia's in favor of Brexit. We know Putin would be pleased to have President Trump to deal with, because Trump wouldn't be interested in, actually would probably feel quite a lot of sympathy for him. So clearly this is all in Russia's interest, because it divides and undermines the West, not only Western political and economic institutions, but also the image of the West in the world, as a stable Western democracy, as a source of stability, as a source of prosperity, and also the underlying sort of liberal order. There is a liberal world order. There are a set of institutions that have held the West together for the last 50 years. And if Russia can, even in a tiny way, help undermine those, then it's good for Russia, because a world with no rules, and a world with no laws, and a world where might is right and the strongest win is a world that's good for Putin. I think we have to find answers. We have to find alternatives. Who's the counter Trump? Who's the person who can express legitimately people's dislike of the current political establishment without offering a violent and anti-democratic alternative, potentially. So you have to look for, who are the other people going to be.